My name's Ed. I'm the owner of a 1935 Cadillac that I purchased in Philadelphia, and it was all apart. So when you buy a car when it's all apart, you don't know if you're getting all the parts or not. And we found out we were missing a steering wheel and we were missing the two headlight lens. And they seemed like they were nowhere to be found. I advertised and everything else, tried to find something. And everybody told me that the headlight lenses were absolutely unattainable. We're here at Alumilite in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we're going to pour this here steering wheel in a little bit and these headlight lenses.
We chose the Plat 55 silicone for this application because one, it's a firmer silicone, it's a 55A durometer silicone, so it will be rigid and provide really good support. Secondly, because the Plat 55 silicone is a platinum system, we'll have zero shrinkage and really replicate the true dimensions of the steering wheel. Lastly, we wanted the firmer durometer so that we had great location between the two halves of the mold. Once we had the Plat 55 thoroughly mixed, with no striations in the silicone, we place the silicone under vacuum to pull out all the excess air. This will allow us to pour a void-free mold. The steering wheel had been embedded in a base of blue Alumilite clay. This clay acts like the second half of the mold while we pour the first half. After the mold was cured, we applied some talc powder to break the surface tension to make the mold a little bit easier to handle. We then added some clumps of clay to support the first half of the mold that we just poured, so that when we flip the mold over, the first half of the mold is supported. Next, we have to remove the base of clay that was used to represent the second half of the mold while we poured the first. It's important here to gently remove the clay, making certain not to disturb the seal between the steering wheel and the first half of the mold that was poured the previous day. It's extremely important to remove all bits of clay that rest against the steering wheel. If any clay exists when we pour the second half of the mold, the clay will cause excess flash and imperfections when the part is cast, which will eventually cause more trimming and finishing. Now that we have the clay removed and the mold is nice and clean, we can go ahead and spray mold release all over the first half of the mold so that when we pour the second half, we don't have any fusing and the molds will separate perfectly. Now that the second half of our mold is cured, we can go ahead and destruct the mold box and separate the mold to remove our original. Before we can cast our first part, we need to cut in a sprue in order to fill resin into the mold. You start by making a larger opening on the outside of the mold which will hold the resin, and then you narrow it down, and when you get right next to the steering wheel, it's really important to cut a very precise line in order to minimize the amount of flash and post work that you'll have to do for finishing the steering wheel afterwards. The cut will need to be made on both halves of the mold, so you need to make some marks in order to navigate what kind of cuts you'll need to make so that they match up. The test cast allows us to see if any air is going to be trapped within the mold so that we can work on removing that air before we put our permanent structure inside the mold and cast over it. Before we cast resin into the mold, we want to put a light coating of talc powder all over the surface. The talc powder acts as a wicking mechanism to help avoid air bubbles once we fill the mold with resin. For this application we're going to be using the Alumi-Res RC3 product. We will also be adding Alumilite black dye to tint the resin. To fill the mold, we held it open at the top and we very slowly poured the resin into one corner, allowing it to naturally flow down and around the mold and up to the top. Once the mold began to fill, we slowly closed the top of the mold and clamped it shut for curing. Once the resin was cured, we disassembled the mold and removed our first test part. So now that this looks good, we can move ahead by inserting our steel frame into the mold, and then we can cast our replica. Placement of the steel frame is extremely important. You want it centered exactly in the mold so that when the resin flows around, we don't have any steel frame showing on the outside perimeter of the steering wheel. Once the frame is in the exact location, we use some clay to shore up the steel frames to help prevent shifting or movement within the mold once we raise the mold into the vertical position for casting. We repeated the process for testing our cast piece by applying talc powder and then slowly pouring the resin into the mold. Once the resin is cured, we can disassemble our mold and remove our newly replicated overmolded steering wheel. Any flash that you see can be removed with a sharp blade. The areas where the sprue port was or the vent lines will need a little extra care in getting those sanded smooth and then polished up. All that's left now is mounting it on the car. If you have any questions about this application or any others, please give us a call at 1-800-447-9344. You can also visit us at alumilite.com for additional information.